I started to get into the chemistry of the brain and understanding the cell. How does the cell function? What makes it tick? And then once I understood that, it was sort of kind of epiphany moment. I said, wow, if this is the cell and that's what is causing this, then it's going to be something within or around or with the cell somehow is not functioning. And so I started to get more into the chemistry part and the physiology part. And I realized, okay, so it's probably something to do with how electricity is moving around. There were some articles, actually, there are plenty that discuss how voltage currents can affect the brain and pain. And they even mention for migraine, but they just don't go further. So they don't explain why it is happening. They say it's happening, but not why. And so I started to experiment, and I discovered, again, another epiphany, that salt was helping. Now I have the explanation of why. At that time, I didn't. And so I started adding salt to my diet, just take salt, with a teaspoon, a quarter teaspoon at that time. And other than a little bit making me feel kind of so nauseated at the beginning, because it's something that can be used to make you vomit if you take some toxin, it actually worked. And I said, okay, so if it's working, maybe there's something to this. And slowly, it took several years of evolving the protocol that I currently have. In fact, it's still evolving. It's continuously evolving. And I recognize it. And if I don't take care of it, which happened a couple of times when I was not in a position to take care of it, like in the middle of giving a lecture or some other situations, then I may actually still come down with a migraine, but then I know how to abort it. Migraine does not need to have a headache to go with it. So we already can separate migraine from headache, because if I can have a migraine without a headache, it clearly isn't a headache. So just by that alone is one way to distinguish. The second way to distinguish is if it responds to simple over-the-counter medications. Migraines don't, because they're not caused by the same processes that regular headaches are caused by, say, stress headache or a sinus headache. They all have different causes. So migraine headache has a very strong physiological cause that can't be undone by a painkiller, because the pain is not the problem, it's the underlying condition. A typical headache can hurt basically all over your head, the back, the ears, the whole thing, the front, everywhere. Migraine doesn't hurt like that. Migraine hurts on one side of the face, and that's it. It can be, not face, but the head. It could be the right side or the left side. It can move during the migraine, but it's never two sides. And there's a physiological reason for this as well. There are some people that claim to have migraines on two sides. I think that what's happening, they may have both sides time to time switching, which some of us do. I do too, time to time. And so when one side is hurting, the other side is sort of kind of compensating and may, in fact, also go down at the same time. But it doesn't, generally speaking, hurt in both sides. And also the length of the headache. So assume a headache, you don't take any medication for it. You just say you eat or drink something, or you go to sleep. It will last maybe a half an hour, 2 hours, something like that. A migraine minimum is 4 hours. So if it's less than 4 hours, it isn't a migraine. So that's right away a distinguisher. And a typical migraine is 3 days long. There are people who just have it one day. It seems to change over time. The older you get, the longer they get for some reason. And they can go for weeks, actually, uninterrupted. It can be really, really problematic. The migraine, in addition to these symptoms, will also have other symptoms. For example, migraineurs usually start migraine with being dizzy. Sea leg is very, very common. They may have vertigo, simply just fall over. They usually vomit. I don't think you vomit from a standard headache. So that's the start of a typical migraine. They usually have a very urgent bowel movement, and this is initiated by what is called the fight or flight syndrome, which is part of migraine. And also a migrainer, you can see oftentimes, for example, half their body will go completely paralyzed. They will fall off of staircases. If it's not the whole body, it may just half. We have several reporters mid-reporting suddenly getting a migraine, and half the face, like the lips will drop and the eyes will drop, and people will think, well, she's having a stroke. No, she just had a migraine. And so our sensory organs are completely different, and we get overstimulated. And this overstimulation has several outcomes if we are comparing the usage of, say, sodium between a migraineur's brain and the brain of a person who's not a migraineur, you're going to see a migraineur needing about 50% more sodium. And there was a study, this was from 1951, where they looked at migraineurs and they checked their urine sodium output compared to other people who were not migraineurs. And they were actually excreting 50% more sodium from the same diet under the same controlled environmental conditions. So migraineurs use 50% more sodium, therefore they excrete 50% more sodium. So if we use more sodium than somebody who doesn't have migraines, well, what does that mean for the brain and for the body? Something is going to give because we don't have then the nourishment that we're supposed to be having. So what initially starts the migraine is being out of some of these nutrients. It isn't just that the migraine brain has more connections between the sensory neurons, but that there are these voltage-dependent or voltage-gated channels, pumps. They're all modified. Recommend for the viewer to visit genecards.org. And genecards.org is basically the human genome setup. So you can put in any kind of health condition and hit enter, and you're going to get all the genes associated with that particular condition. The first one is called ATP1A2. So what is ATP? That's the ATPase pump. So that's the sodium potassium pump. So that is the one that allows sodium to come into the neurons to generate the action potential. And then sodium leaves and potassium comes back in to create a resting potential. And then there's a refractory period. If this doesn't work, and if there's not enough sodium, well, the next time when the sodium is supposed to come in to start an action potential, oops, maybe there isn't enough sodium. Maybe the gate or pump can't open. So what happens then? That neuron can't then transmit a message. And so this is the first one. Now let's look at the second one. The second one is SCN1A. That is a sodium voltage-gated channel subunit 1. All of these are basically organizing the cell's firing ability. The next one, and this is important for our discussion because we're talking nutrition, SLC1A3. What is that? That is actually a glucose transport, sodium transport for glucose. It's a solute carrier because we only have one glucose transporter that uses insulin, which is GLUT4, but GLUT1, 2, 3, and I think there's one more, I forget now which one. These actually use sodium to get glucose into the cells, all associated with either the channel, the neurons channel or not functioning, or the carrying of the glucose in or out of the cell. So we have a problem with I would call channelopathy, and that is actually technically what it is, channelopathy. And so channelopathy, the definition, is caused by disrupted functions of the ion channel. So what I have just described are all the ion channels that are disrupted in the migraine brain, which aren't so in a regular brain. So when it comes to then eating foods that either contain an inappropriate balance of the sodium and potassium, the calcium, magnesium, etc. And by the way, magnesium was not mentioned here, but ATPase is actually a magnesium opening gate. Okay. So the magnesium has to attach to open to it. So we basically covered the magnesium, calcium, potassium, sodium, and glucose. We covered all the elements that would be essential for the brain to function in this case. And so we can see that migraineurs have a huge problem there. So it's a physiological difference built on top of an anatomical difference, which is that migraineurs have more sensory neuron connections. So we would need more sodium and more potassium and more water and a richer electrolyte, but we have less because we use more. And on the pumps on the top of it don't function too well. So they can't open, they can't close. So the start of the migraine is actually the breaking down of this system temporarily for being low in one of these, either sodium or potassium usually is a culprit, and often of course water is essential to pass it in, or there's too much glucose. And so where the glucose is coming in. So when we consume glucose, for everyone, glucose replaces sodium and water when it enters the cells. That's is in every single ER book and everywhere. So this is normal. when a migraineur eats glucose, and by glucose, I understand carbohydrates of any kind, including lettuce, it doesn't matter what kind it is, it's going to cause the efflux of sodium and water from the cells. And it's going to disrupt the electrolyte. And this leads to migraine. If the migraineur doesn't eat carbohydrates, this is not going to happen. And so here's the cause of migraine. There's no potassium in sugar. Now, if he chooses to eat, say, a sweet potato, he's okay, because sweet potato is very rich in potassium. So if he has to take a lot of sodium after that, or salt after that, and by the way, sodium is 40% of salt. So before people get confused, it's just part of salt. So if you take salt after a very rich, potassium-rich sweet potato, you're probably fine. Mm. But if you're eating something else, say you eat a slice of cake, which is a lot of grains, not gluten necessarily, but any kind of a grain. And of course, just pure sugar and maybe fat like butter, good tasting, yummy cake, with no potassium at all. And then you take sodium, you're going to be in trouble, because then you have an electrolyte imbalance. And we also have to remember that we have a kidney system, the RAAS, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and our blood circulates about 5 times per hour. So you have 12 minutes basically before any excess sodium that you take in is going to be washed out of your body if you have a healthy kidney. And so just eating sugar and eating salt is going to continuously cause an electrolyte imbalance, not necessarily in the brain alone, but in the body. And so your kidneys will dump that sodium. And as a result of the fact that you don't have potassium, that you didn't eat the potassium, you're becoming dehydrated, because the RAAS system will remove the sodium and will dump a little bit of water to go with it, because it has to pass with urine. Right. But since you don't have any potassium, it's going to spare or retain the potassium, but it's going to dump or waste the excess sodium. So taking all the time just salt to make up for your carbohydrate intake is not really going to be good for you, first of all. So your kidneys are going to be working a lot harder, and you may cause some kidney trouble with that. And second of all, it isn't going to achieve the goal, because sodium is never going to get to the place where it's supposed to get to.
Some people, even if they're eating not a ton of salt, their body will retain it. And the thought is, because of the adrenals being very taxed, they'll kind of hold on to these salts. So how does that relate to this? Does it relate to it?
It does. And you're very correct, because many times people who come to me with a chronic fatigue syndrome, which is also an adrenal issue, if you're just taking as much sodium as your body actually needs. And so we have to sort of distinguish. So if I have a migraine because I just ate a slice of cake, I didn't need sodium. I had to take it because I just kicked myself out of balance. Right. And so all that extra water and extra sodium that I had in my cells before the glucose from the cake kicked it out went into edema. So edema is a storage place for the body to retain water. So when you're talking about your patients getting problem, they're retaining it because they're taking the cell in the wrong way, and they're not balancing it properly with potassium. And if you have a high adrenaline to start with, and you can't take so much sodium because it's just going to increase it, it will increase it only if you're just taking sodium. But as long as you're taking it in balance with potassium, it won't. So you have to look at, what am I eating? And if I'm eating that, what does it do to my body? If you have a health issue, you have to modify what you eat. You can't eat the same way as other people who don't have that health condition, particularly if the health condition is sensitive to nutrients, and most are.
You know, because I get asked that a lot. On a low carb, ketogenic, carnivore diet, how much sodium am I supposed to be consuming that's enough?
Okay, so I don't go by the salted taste. Many people, particularly migrainists for some
reason, yeah, that's true.
Hate salt. So we're not going to, because many of us are super tasters. I'm super taster, so I will not even salt my food. So I'll take my salt in a pill. That may just mislead you, and some people may just like salt too much, yes. And then they eat too much. So that's not a good measure. But so the people without migraines, there are a couple of studies, one in the British Medical Journal, one in the Lancet, where they discover, one of them goes through the NHANES, which is a huge database, and two others. One was I think actually a clinical trial or some sort of experiment, and the other one was another database analysis. And they have come up with the ideal number for a person who does not have migraines. So just a general population. And within the population, they had two groups, ones with heart disease and ones without. So it was a good study. And I think this was a British Medical Journal. And what they discovered is that the ideal sodium starts at 4,500 milligrams. But the USDA is currently 2,300 milligrams. So what they showed is that if you go below 4,500, your risk of heart disease actually increases. And I can explain why that is happening. And they showed that if you get down to, I think it was 1,200 milligrams of sodium, you actually will die. It's just that bad. It just came to that level of risk. So the curve was sort of like you die here and then you come down, this is ideal. And then it was like a very, very, very long tail. It went all the way to 12,000 milligrams of sodium.
Wow.
Where to that point, nothing happened to those who were healthy individuals. 4,500 to 6,500 was the ideal. This is where the curve hit the bottom to be the ideal. And some people went lower, meaning that they actually increased their livelihood. They increased their life and health by increasing sodium up to 12,000 milligrams sodium. And for those who were cardiovascularly compromised, it seemed the 3,500 to 4,000 milligrams sodium was the ideal for them as well. We have approximately 5 liters of blood, give and take, for our height and age and weight. And this blood has to contain a certain amount of sodium. And the amount of sodium that it contains, it could be different to some degree. But the role of the sodium is not just to cause an action potential for the nerves, but it also is a salt. The chloride, for example, creates hydrochloric acid in your stomach. So your stomach acid requires salt. An average person carries approximately 1 pound in salt. That is a huge amount that you carry in you, because you basically have a little mini ocean in your body, and every single cell is basically floating in the seawater. Mm-hmm. So we have to retain the seawater quality to all of our cells. And if you don't, if you remove the amount of salt in your blood, not only will your cells not have enough salt and they will want to retain the salt, thereby causing some trouble, but you will also cause a huge problem for your blood, because the blood has a given volume, as I said earlier, 5 liters. If you remove the sodium, say you reduce it, it automatically reduces the amount of water your blood will contain. So you reduce your blood volume. And so what does that mean? It means that now less amount of fluid has to pass around 5 times, as opposed to earlier you had more pass around 5 times. So you have to increase the speed with which it goes and the pressure with which it goes. So reduced sodium diet actually increases blood pressure. And this is yet to reach doctors and people in general. So most people who have hypertension, they put them on a reduced salt diet. Next thing they know, they will have increased the medication, and before they know, they're on 4 different medications and a diuretic medication, and they just keep on taking the low salt. But if you give them salt, the blood pressure goes down. We had people who said, we had them sign a waiver in the group, and they said, yeah, well, I have completely out of control blood pressure. My doctors gave up on me. I'm taking 4 medications. Just do whatever you do. And they came off all the medications, stopped drinking their Cokes and other kind of drinks and a lot of coffee a day. And they just had salt and water, and their blood pressure completely normalized. So it isn't the salt, it's what else we're eating. First of all, it depends upon how much water we drink, because you don't want to take too much salt unless you also drink enough water to go with it. So there's a formula that we use, and which I'm sure you're also familiar with, to calculate how much water a person needs to drink minimally. I exclude water from food, because the water in food, even in watermelon, yes, there's a lot of water in there. Go get a tea. It has a lot of water in there, but you try to separate it. What does it take for you to separate the water from the tea? You have to boil that thing, and you have to collect the water and drip it, and then you have water and the tea stays in a cup. So it is a chemical process. It isn't available for your cells to use as a free water. If you look back at tribes that live even today in a carnivore or the ancestral ways, they're basically carnivores, but there's a whole lot of food that they eat that we don't eat. Blood is one of them. Right. Blood is actually milk is a primary food. So if you look back, even some of the today living tribes, there's a film series on Amazon Prime, I think it was, that's called Tribes, and it's 4 different tribes, and they have their own herds of sheep or goats or camel, some of them, and some cows. And whenever they slaughter an animal, they will eat the animal, but they don't do that every day. So therefore, they live off of the milk of the animal. And also they bleed the animals. So they will cut a little blood vessel and collect the blood. They close it back up so they don't kill the animal, but they regularly bleed the animals and they eat it. And if you look at how much sodium is in your blood, is exactly how much sodium should be in your food, because that is why you're eating the sodium, right? So if you drink an animal's blood, you're getting the sodium that you need because it has the right amount of sodium. And the same with milk. Milk has sodium in it. So in nature, if you're carnivore, provided that you are not in a city folk, but you're living out, say, in the savannah, and you don't have internet, you don't have telephone, you don't have any of those electrical disturbances which are stimulants, and you don't have light, so you go to sleep when the sun goes down and you wake up when the sun wakes up, then you probably won't need to salt your food, because you will have all the salt that you need, because your stimulus is going to be less. But in our modern lives, this is not incompatible with us. So what I find is a lot of carnivores come to me and say, well, I don't need to salt my food, I'm fine. But I have a problem because if I salt my food, I retain water. I said, okay, so that means you need to salt your water because the reason why your body is retaining the extra salt and water is because you're not giving it to it. The body is not stupid. It will hold on to. When it gets it, it's going to save it and collect it. And so it's better for you to continually provide it to the body so the body can relax and say, okay, I'm getting this, so I don't have to retain it. When you go on a ketogenic diet or carnivore diet, the first thing that normally happens is that people lose a lot of instant weight. And that instant weight is just water and salt. And that's because insulin holds on to sodium. Again, because we have a lot of channels that don't use insulin, but use sodium instead to press the glucose into the cells. In our modern nutritional time, it's insulin's responsibility to take glucose out of our blood and press it into the cells that are full and don't want to have any more glucose. And so insulin holds on to sodium, and also water. And so when you stop eating carbohydrates, first thing that's going to happen is that as your insulin drops, you will drop a lot of water and a lot of salt. And so you will have to actually increase the amount of sodium or salt that you're taking when you start your ketogenic or carnivore diet, because your body will dump a lot. And so you will have to replenish it to come back up to zero. So when people complain that I just started ketogenic diet, but I didn't feel good, so I quit. Well, you didn't feel good because you didn't have enough salt. And they start on the protocol and they slowly increase their water and they slowly add salt for regularly. Those who have very little water to change and they just simply add the salt right away, they can become migraine free. Or at least reduce their migraines to the point of, wow, I haven't had one for 7 days, whereas I used to have one all the time, very quickly, some within 2 weeks. And then there are some people who take a lot longer. But in general, we have to consider the healing process. So it's a body that we broke, right? It isn't going to recover so fast. The body, in terms of salt, we're talking about kidney involvement, we're talking about the heart, we're talking about blood, we're talking about everything is affected, and all these organs have different time frames for repair, for recovery. And so it can take very long or very short. It very much depends on the person and how much of a change is required to reach the goal. It isn't toxin per se. A toxin, you can get major headaches, you can get fever, you can get many things, I suppose. I don't know because luckily I've never had it. But migraine is just so specifically genetic that you either have it or you don't have it. And it's just very specific to the stimulation coming in. If I don't eat carbohydrates, and if I'm a migrainer and I don't eat any, I may not even know I'm a migrainer. So you can totally exclude it from your life if you so you choose. Sumatriptan has basically 2 parts to it that are supposed to work. One is that it is supposed to initiate a little bit of serotonin release, because there's a belief that the migraineurs have not enough serotonin, which is false, and that's another point. And the other function of it is to constrict the blood vessels So it's a vasoconstrictor. And it mimics like you have a couple of cups of coffee, and so your blood vessels constrict. And the constriction, what that does, it increases the speed with which the blood circulates. And so whatever sodium you have in your blood, it has a tendency to go faster to the right place. So it can, if you have blood sodium elsewhere, it can't go to the right place. And we have to say that even though sodium is pretty well balanced everywhere in the body, there could be differences in different organs at different times. And so it is important to have a good circulation, and sumatriptan increases the blood circulation by increasing the blood pressure by vasoconstricting. So this is the good part of it. The bad part of it is that it's a drug. You can achieve very similar effects by simply having a cup of coffee. So you don't really need to have a sumatriptan and to take a drug that has other side effects. One of them, for example, is a rebound pain. So if you take sumatriptan or other kind of triptans several times a week, I think 2 is the maximum per day and 3 max per week that you can take. But I've seen people who took 2 to 3 a day, every single day for a whole month. So we're talking about major problems there, because then they become adapted to this, and it will cause a rebound headache when they stop taking it. So we then have to taper off of triptans. We've had to do that with many people. And I, by the way, was a triptan user, and I used a nasal spray, which had a direct access to me because I couldn't tolerate the stomach. Because when you take a serotonin, only 10% of the serotonin is actually made and used by the brain, and 90% is in your intestines. So what does it do? It causes diarrhea and cramps, which a migraine already comes with. So that's the last thing you want to have. And so many people can't tolerate, so you can get them in injection and inhalers and nasal spray, all kinds of variety of ways to avoid the stomach because of what it causes. But there's no serotonin need in the brain of the migraineur. It is so clearly a sodium-potassium problem with the channels and the gates that don't work, that adding extra serotonin, it just simply reduces the sensation of, yes, I'm feeling dizzy, yes, I'm about to throw up, yes, I'm feeling totally depressed because I have this pain. So it may make me feel better, but it doesn't do anything with the migraine. It doesn't help the migraine. So medications, like the most recent one, of course, is the CGRP, which is a calcitonin gene inhibitor. And what that one does too, it's a Band-Aid, as we talked earlier. It actually seeks out the nerves that are responsible for the pain, the nociceptors, and then it blocks them. So you can't sense the pain. The problem is that these receptors exist everywhere in our body. And so I got a call from a person who had her pancreas wiped out.
Wow.
And shut the insulin progression out of her. It just, no matter what she was doing, the insulin was just dumping. And by that time, I think she was 2 months after that she took her last dose. And because the half-time of these drugs is usually 1 month, it can take up to 6 to 8 months to clear from the system. So we were just hoping, and I don't know what happened to her because I lost touch with her, but we were hoping that her pancreas will recover after this insult. We have just a couple of days ago, I logged into one of these CGRP groups on Facebook, and somebody said, does anybody have exploding headache? It's like, feels like your head explodes. People lose their hair. They have all kinds of problems. So when we're looking at medications, and we know that what migraine is, we know that it can completely be prevented by the proper nutrition and extra sodium. It takes a little strength to get ourselves to get off all those grains and to not eat all those sugar and to avoid even foods such as banana or chocolate, not necessarily just because of sugar, but also because they're very high in potassium. So we need to salt them in order to sort of balance them. It can be problematic and difficult to stop all that. But if you put all these things together and you look at the alternatives, and look at the problems, the side effects, and the brain degeneration they cause. It depends on it. Yeah. Is it worth it? It's a bit in the consciousness of the person to decide what it is that they wish